The sun was not yet a tyrant. In the thin gray light of a western Arizona dawn, it was only a silver promise on the horizon, bleaching the color from the vast expanse of prairie and stone. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything, clinging to the scrubby mesquite and the long spines of the ocotillo that reached like skeletal fingers toward the pale sky. The air was cool for now, but carried the scent of dry earth and the coming heat, a smell of thirst. Eliza's heart moved with the quiet economy of someone who knew the land's unforgiving nature. At 22, her face, framed by dark hair pulled back severely, already held the steady gaze of a woman twice her age. There were no wasted movements as she guided the small herd of cattle, their bony hips swaying in a slow, tired rhythm. They were all that was left, the last dozen head of the Hart Ranch, and their survival, like her own, depended on the thin green vein of water that trickled through Blanca Canyon. The stream was a miracle, a secret whispered from rock to rock, and the only thing keeping them from ruin. Every footstep kicked up a puff of ochre dust. A hawk circled high overhead, its cry a lonely, sharp note in the immense silence. Eliza knew its language, the language of this place. It spoke of patience, of watching, of the swift and sudden nature of life and death. She carried a Winchester rifle cradled in one arm, not with aggression, but with the same casual necessity that a farmer carries a hoe. The world was beautiful, but it was not kind. Her father, Silas Hart, had once been a man who understood that. Now, he understood only the bottom of a whiskey bottle and the crushing weight of the ledger book he kept locked in his desk. The book was a testament to his failings, its pages filled with the spidery script of Avery Pike. Pike owned the town's only saloon, its only bank, and half the land the new railroad was set to cross. He collected debts the way the desert collected bones, patiently and without sentiment. Sheriff Doolin, a man whose spine seemed to have dissolved in Pike's whiskey, was little more than a uniformed errand boy. The debt was a sickness in their small clapboard house, a constant, unspoken dread that soured the air and stooped her father's shoulders. Eliza bore the weight of it, just as she bore the weight of the sun on her back. As she neared the canyon's mouth, the lowing of the cattle grew more eager. They smelled the water. But another scent reached Eliza, one that made her halt and raise a hand to shade her eyes. Wood smoke, faint but unmistakable. She pulled the herd to a stop behind a jumble of red rock, her heart thumping a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. Rumors, carried on the wind like tumbleweeds, had been skittering through the nearby settlement for weeks. Clashes with the Chiricahua Apache, a prospector found dead, a supply wagon raided. The stories were always vague, told in hushed, fearful tones that painted every Apache as a phantom of violence. Blanca Canyon was their territory, a place where treaty lines blurred and the only law was survival. Peering around the edge of a sun-warmed boulder, she saw them, downstream, where the water pooled in a shallow basin before disappearing again into the sand, were a half-dozen Apache warriors and their horses. They were not a war party. Their movements were calm, deliberate, as they let their animals drink. One man stood slightly apart, his back to the rising sun. He was tall for an Apache, with a stillness about him that was more commanding than any loud gesture. Even from this distance, Eliza could sense an authority in his posture, in the way the others deferred to him without a word. This had to be the leader they spoke of, Nantan Kohana. Her own cattle began to shift, restless and thirsty. There was not enough water for two herds, not enough space for two peoples steeped in mutual suspicion. A standoff was inevitable. She could turn back, but the cattle would not survive another day without this water. Pride, and the simple, stubborn grit of necessity, straightened her spine. She clucked her tongue, urging her own animals forward. As she stepped out from behind the rocks, a ripple of awareness moved through the group downstream. Hands moved subtly toward weapons, but the leader, Kohana, simply turned his head. His face was stark, defined by high cheekbones and a firm jaw, his expression unreadable. He watched her approach, his dark eyes missing nothing. There was no menace in his gaze, but an intense, focused curiosity. The look of a man assessing every detail of a potential threat, or a potential equal. Eliza's heart hammered, but her face remained a calm mask. She did not raise her rifle. She walked slowly, bringing her cattle to the water's edge a good 50 yards upstream from them, respecting a silent boundary. The air crackled with tension. Her cows and their horses drank from the same lifeblood, while their masters stood separated by a gulf of fear and history. Eliza focused on her animals, but she was intensely aware of the man watching her. Their eyes met across the shimmering heat rising from the creek bed. It was a long, silent exchange. She saw not a savage from the fearful fireside stories, but a man who was also trying to keep his people alive in a world that was shrinking around them. In his gaze, she saw a reflection of her own burden, a quiet dignity that resonated with the core of her own self-respect. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, not of friendship, but of acknowledgement. Then he turned, and with a few quiet words in his own tongue, gathered his men. They mounted their horses and melted back into the canyons, leaving behind only the damp earth and the lingering scent of wood smoke. Eliza did not realize she had been holding her breath until it escaped her in a long, shuddering sigh. Later that afternoon, as she herded the cattle back toward the ranch, she found one of her mares caught in a crudely made wolf trap, its leg bleeding. Frustration and fear welled up in her. Losing a horse was a blow they could not afford. As she worked to free the frightened animal, she heard a sound and looked up to see two of her other horses, which had strayed, being driven gently back toward her from a box canyon. Two Apache youths on ponies guided them, then vanished as quickly as they had appeared. Near the trap, Eliza found the remains of two wolves, killed cleanly. Propped on a rock was a single hawk feather tied with a strip of yucca fiber. It was not a threat. It was a message, a sign of peace, or perhaps something more complex, a gesture that said, "We are not the monsters of your stories. We see you. We share this land." The truth, she realized, was far more complicated than the simple tales of hatred whispered in town. That evening, the mood in the small ranch house was heavier than usual. The air was thick with the smell of stale whiskey and unspoken despair. Silas sat at the rough-hewn table, the infamous ledger open before him. He did not eat the stew Eliza had prepared. He just stared at the columns of numbers that represented their bondage to Avery Pike, his hand trembling as he traced the figures. "Pike sent word," he mumbled, not looking at her. "He's coming by tomorrow, about the loan." Eliza said nothing, just continued to clean her rifle. The rhythmic click and slide of the mechanism, a counterpoint to her father's labored breathing. She knew what that meant. Pike never came by for a friendly chat. He came to tighten the screws. Later, long after the moon had risen to cast a ghostly light over the prairie, Eliza was jolted from a light sleep. A floorboard had creaked. She sat up, her senses instantly alert. Through the thin wall of her bedroom, she heard the scrape of a chair and the soft rustle of paper. Peeking through a crack in the door, she saw her father by the faint light of a dying lamp. He was dressed in his dusty riding coat. He tucked the ledger book inside it, his movements furtive and full of a desperate haste. He blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. And then the front door opened and closed with a barely audible click. A cold knot of dread tightened in Eliza's stomach. Her father was a weak man, a man broken by loss and debt, but he was not a fool. Sneaking out in the middle of the night with the very symbol of their servitude could only mean one thing. He was going to see Pike, and a man like Silas Hart, meeting a wolf like Avery Pike in the dead of night, would not be negotiating. He would be capitulating. He would be selling something. A terrible premonition washed over her, as cold and vast as the desert night. Her father was about to make a deal, and she had a sickening feeling that she was the price. The sun returned as a tyrant. It clawed its way over the mountains, pouring heat and a blinding white light onto the parched land. By the time Silas Hart stumbled back to the ranch, he looked like a man who had wrestled with demons and lost spectacularly. His face was the color of ash. His eyes were bloodshot and hollow, and he carried the stench of cheap whiskey and utter defeat. He collapsed into a chair at the table, the ledger book falling from his coat and landing with a soft, final thud. He did not look at Eliza. He could not. Eliza stood by the cold stove, a tin cup of water in her hand. She had been waiting. The dread that had settled in her gut the night before had solidified into a cold, hard certainty. She watched him, her expression unreadable, her posture rigid with a tension that went beyond weariness. "You sold the last of the herd," she stated. It was not a question. Silas flinched, his gaze fixed on the floorboards. "He gave me an extension. Ellie, a little more time." His voice was a raw, broken whisper. "The water rights, too. He gets the rights." He had sold their future. The cattle were their present, but the water was their soul. The only reason this patch of dust and rock was a ranch and not a grave. He had sold it all for a few more weeks of drinking himself into oblivion. A bitter anger, sharp and clean, cut through Eliza's fear. Before she could speak, a frantic knocking sounded at the door. It was Maria Ortega, their closest neighbor, a woman whose face was a roadmap of 60 years of hardship and kindness. Her dark eyes were wide with alarm. She hurried inside, her shawl clutched tightly around her shoulders despite the growing heat. "Eliza, child, something terrible is happening," she said, her voice a rapid, hushed Spanish mixed with English. She had been in town for supplies and had lingered in the shadows behind the saloon. "I heard Pike. He was with the sheriff, boasting." Maria wrung her hands, her gaze darting toward Silas, who seemed to shrink even further into himself. "He made your father sign everything, but that is not the worst of it. It is a trick, a devil's bargain." She explained what she had overheard. Avery Pike, full of whiskey and arrogance, had laid out his plan to Sheriff Doolin. The Apache leader, Kohana, had sent a peaceful overture, a request to formally negotiate shared access to the water in Blanca Canyon. Pike saw this not as an opportunity for peace, but for power. He was twisting the request into a demand. "Pike told the sheriff he would set the terms," Maria said, her voice trembling with indignation. "He told your father the Apache chief demanded a guarantee, a person, to ensure the treaty is kept." Her eyes, full of pity and horror, finally settled on Eliza. "He is telling everyone that to secure peace, the Hart Ranch must provide a hostage. He is giving them you, Eliza." The room fell silent. The buzzing of a fly against the window pane sounded as loud as a gunshot. Eliza turned her head slowly, her calm expression finally breaking, replaced by a glacial fury. She looked at her father, a man so utterly broken he was no longer recognizable. "Hostage," Eliza said, "the word tasting like poison. That is the word he used for it." Silas finally looked up, his eyes swimming with tears of self-pity. He would have taken the ranch. "Ellie, we would have nothing. He said it was the only way. A meeting. Just a meeting, to show good faith. You would be safe. He swore it." "Safe," she repeated, her voice devoid of emotion. "Like our cattle are safe now that they belong to him, like our water is safe?" She took a step closer, her shadow falling over him. He was a creature of the dark now, and she was the one standing in the unforgiving light. Her voice dropped to a low, chilling whisper. "You did not sell the ranch to save it. You sold me to save yourself another week with a bottle. Since you are so good at selling your daughter, why not sell your own liver? Father, it must be worth something, pickled as it is." A raw, guttural sob escaped Silas. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking, but Eliza felt no pity. The part of her that loved him, the part that remembered him as a strong man who smelled of leather and sunshine, had withered and died in that moment. The sound of approaching horses interrupted the grim tableau. Through the window, Eliza saw them Sheriff Doolin, looking fat and uncomfortable in his saddle, and two of Pike's hired men, their faces hard and impersonal. They were not a posse. They were delivery men. "It is time," Eliza said flatly. Maria grabbed her arm. "You cannot go. We can hide you. Run!" Eliza gently removed the older woman's hand. "Run where?" "Maria, to what this is my home. He will not chase me from it." She looked at her father one last time. "This is your doing, but my life is my own. Remember that." She turned and walked into her small bedroom, closing the door behind her. Her hands did not shake. Her movements were precise, methodical. She was not a lamb being led to slaughter. She was a survivor. From a small wooden chest under her bed, she retrieved a thin, sharp skinning knife, its blade honed to a razor's edge. She slipped it into the top of her sturdy leather boot, pulling her skirt down to cover it completely. It was a small thing, a cold piece of steel against her skin, but it was a promise, a seed of freedom. When she emerged, Doolin and the others were already inside. The sheriff would not meet her eyes, his gaze fixed on a crack in the floor. Pike's men, however, looked right at her, their expressions a mixture of business and a faint, cruel amusement. One of them held a length of rope. "There will be no need for that," Eliza said, her voice as steady as a rock. "I will walk." The man shrugged, coiling the rope back onto his saddle. He was disappointed. They rode out, Eliza mounted on her own mare, flanked by the two hired guns. Sheriff Doolin trailed behind, a reluctant witness to the proceedings. She did not look back at the small ranch house where her father sat stewing in his own shame. She looked forward, toward the jagged peaks of the mountains, toward Blanca Canyon. The ride was long and silent, broken only by the plodding of hooves and the creak of saddle leather. The sun beat down relentlessly. Her captors offered her no water, and she asked for none. She focused on the rhythm of her horse, on the feel of the cool steel against her leg, on the quiet, burning resolve in her chest. She was property being delivered, a piece of a transaction, but in her own mind, she was something else entirely. She was a woman who had been betrayed, but not broken, a woman who carried a knife in her boot and a fire in her heart. She was a force moving toward an unknown collision, and she would not be passive in the outcome. As the afternoon light began to fade, painting the sky in brutal streaks of orange and purple, they reached the mouth of the canyon. The air grew cooler here, the shadows long and deep. The rocks rose up like silent, ancient sentinels, guarding the entrance to the Apache lands. One of Pike's men raised a hand, calling a halt. "This is as far as we go," he said, his voice tight with nervousness. "They know we're coming. They'll come for her." They dismounted, pulling her from her horse. They did not tie her, but stood close, their presence a cage of muscle and steel. Eliza stood before the yawning entrance to the canyon, a lone figure caught between two worlds. Behind her was the world of lies, debts, and betrayal. Before her lay the unknown, the world of the people her father had used as a pawn in his cowardly game. The wind whispered through the canyon, carrying with it the scent of dust and sage, and something else, something wild and untamed. The last of the sun's light vanished behind the peaks, and the land was plunged into twilight. This was the border. This was where her old life ended. The waiting began. They did not wait long. From the direction of the town, more riders approached, their forms dark against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. It was Avery Pike himself, flanked by another two men. He rode a big black gelding that matched his own imposing frame and expensive black coat. He reined in his horse a few yards away, his eyes sweeping over the scene with the satisfaction of a man admiring his own handiwork. He looked at Eliza as if she were a prize mare he had just purchased. "Sheriff!" Pike's voice boomed, falsely jovial. "Everything seems to be in order. Our end of the bargain is here and accounted for." He gave Eliza a thin, predatory smile, a bit dusty, but she will do. Eliza met his gaze without flinching. Her silence was a wall he could not breach with his easy arrogance. Pike's smile tightened. He was not used to being met with anything other than fear or greed. Just then, figures emerged from the deep shadows of the canyon. They moved with a ghost-like quiet that made Pike's men shift uneasily in their saddles. It was Nantan Kohana, followed by a handful of his warriors. They were on foot, carrying unlit torches and their weapons held in a neutral, non-threatening manner. Kohana stopped 20 feet from Pike's group, the space between them charged with a palpable energy. His eyes, however, went first to Eliza, a flicker of recognition in their dark depths. Pike cleared his throat, assuming the role of master negotiator. Nantan Kohana, he began, his tone condescending. I am Avery Pike. We are here to accept your terms for peace and the sharing of the water. As you can see, we have brought the guarantee you demanded. He gestured toward Eliza with a sweep of his hand. The girl from the Hart Ranch, a sign of good faith, just as your messenger requested. Kohana's expression did not change. His gaze remained level, his posture calm. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried in the still air with absolute clarity. Your messenger spoke of sharing water, Kohana said, his English precise. He spoke of drawing lines on a map so our herds would not meet in anger. He did not speak of trading women like cattle. Pike let out a short, dismissive laugh. Come now, Chief. Let us not play games. A treaty needs teeth, a guarantee. Your people get the water, we get peace. And to ensure that peace, the girl stays with you. Those were the terms. Those were your terms, Mr. Pike. Kohana corrected him softly. They were never ours. The Chiricahua do not buy people. We ask only for a map, showing the veins of the springs, so that we may draw our water in the high sun and your people may draw it in the low sun. So there is no conflict. That is the price of peace, a piece of paper with lines, not a woman's life. The lie was laid bare, stark and ugly in the fading light. Sheriff Doolin's face went pale, and he looked down at his saddle horn as if fascinated by the leatherwork. Pike's men exchanged confused, uneasy glances. Their employer's righteous cause had just evaporated into thin air. Pike's face darkened, a flush of fury creeping up his thick neck. Are you calling me a liar? Pike snarled, his voice losing its smooth veneer. I am stating what is true, Kohana replied, his calmness an infuriating counterpoint to Pike's rage. One of Pike's men, a jittery man with a twitchy eye, decided to take matters into his own hands. Perhaps he thought he was helping, or perhaps he just wanted the terrifying encounter to be over. He reached out to grab Eliza's arm, to physically push her forward and complete the transaction. Get on with it, the man grunted. Let us give them what they want. The movement was a spark in a powder keg, in a motion so swift it was a blur. Eliza's hand shot down to her boot. The thin, bright blade of the skinning knife appeared in her hand. The tip pressed firmly against the soft underside of the man's wrist before he could even tighten his grip. He froze, his eyes widening in shock and pain as a single drop of blood welled up where the point pricked his skin. Take your hand off me, Eliza said, her voice low and as sharp as the blade she held. The man snatched his hand back as if he had touched a hot stove. The clearing fell into a stunned silence. Pike stared, his mouth agape. His hired men took a half-step back. Even Kohana's warriors watched with a new, keen interest. Eliza did not put the knife away. Holding it loosely at her side, she stepped forward into the open ground between the two groups, claiming the space as her own. She was no longer a package to be delivered. She was a player in the game. I am not a guarantee, she announced, her voice ringing with a strength she did not know she possessed. Her gaze swept over all of them, from Pike's furious face to Kohana's impassive one. I do not belong to my father. I do not belong to Mr. Pike. I am not a token to be traded for water or peace or anything else. I belong to myself. Your agreements are your own. They do not include me. For a long moment, no one moved. The sheer audacity of her defiance held them all captive. Avery Pike was the first to recover, his face purple with rage, his entire scheme, His public justification for seizing the heartland through this manufactured incident was crumbling before his eyes. He had been made a fool of, and he could not abide it. "You ungrateful little," he began. But Kohana took a single, deliberate step forward, and the threat died in Pike's throat. Kohana's eyes were fixed on Eliza. He saw not a piece of property, but the woman who had faced him with quiet courage at the creek, the woman who now held a blade with the same steady resolve. He saw a spirit that matched his own. Ignoring Pike completely, he spoke directly to her. "You speak the truth," he said. "Your life is your own." He then turned his head slightly toward Pike, though his attention remained on Eliza. "We will have a truce. For 1 moon, your people can use the water from sunup until the noon heat. My people will use it from that time until sunset. There will be no trouble, as long as this line is respected. At the end of the moon, we will meet again and make the agreement permanent." He looked back at Eliza. "You are free to go where you will." Pike was trapped. To refuse the reasonable offer now, after his lie had been exposed, would reveal him as the true warmonger. In front of the sheriff and his own men, he had no choice. "Fine," he spat, the word clipped with anger. He wheeled his horse around. "Let the savages have their water. For now," he jabbed a finger at Eliza. "But you, girl, you will regret this defiance." He and his men rode off, their departure a cloud of angry dust and impotent threats. Sheriff Doolin, looking profoundly miserable, trotted after them like a lost puppy. Eliza stood alone as the sound of their hoofbeats faded. The tension drained out of her, leaving a profound weariness in its place. She finally lowered the knife, her hand trembling slightly from the spent adrenaline. Kohana approached her, stopping a few feet away. He held out his hand, palm up. In it lay a simple, flat bracelet, intricately woven from the pale green fibers of a yucca plant. "For a brave woman," he said, "this is a symbol of a promise, a sign of peace between equals. It does not bind you. It is a sign of respect." She hesitated for only a second before placing the knife back in her boot and accepting the gift. His fingers brushed hers as she took it, his skin warm and dry. The bracelet was light but strong. She slipped it onto her wrist. It felt like a connection, not a chain. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a slight nod. As he turned to rejoin his men, one of the younger warriors, a boy who could not be more than 17, grinned at her. "When you drew that knife," the young man said in slightly accented English, his eyes bright with admiration, "I think the wind itself was afraid of being cut." A small, surprised smile touched Eliza's lips for the first time in what felt like a lifetime. The simple, honest humor was a balm on her raw nerves. It was a human moment, a bridge across the chasm of their two cultures. Kohana and his warriors disappeared back into the canyon as silently as they had come, leaving her alone in the deepening twilight. She stood at the crossroads, the woven band on her wrist a tangible reminder of the day's impossible events. Behind her lay a home that was no longer a sanctuary. Before her lay a wilderness that was no longer just a threat. She was free, and she had no idea what to do next. Avery Pike's humiliation was a toxic vapor that settled over the small town, publicly exposed as a liar and a manipulator. He did not retreat into shame. Instead, he cultivated a seething, venomous anger. The truce over the water at Blanca Canyon was, to him, a personal defeat, and Eliza Hart's defiance was an unforgivable insult. He saw her not as a woman who had claimed her freedom, but as a piece of property that had rebelled. His obsession with crushing her and the Apache she had inadvertently allied with festered in the heat. He knew the townsfolk were now wary, and Sheriff Doolin was too spineless for any direct action. Pike needed a bigger weapon. He needed the United States Army. His journey took him 30 miles east to Fort Grant, a dusty collection of adobe buildings baking under the Arizona sun. There, he presented his case to Sergeant Miles O'Rourke, the ranking officer in the commander's absence. O'Rourke was a wiry man in his late 30s, with a sun-bleached mustache and clear blue eyes that seemed to absorb everything without judgment. He was a career soldier, a man who believed in order, evidence, and the chain of command, not the fevered rumors of frontier landowners. Pike spun a masterful tale of Apache aggression. He spoke of veiled threats, of a chief who had demanded a white woman as a tribute, and of a fragile peace that was sure to be broken by the savages at any moment. He painted himself as a beleaguered community leader trying to prevent a massacre. Sergeant O'Rourke listened patiently, his hands resting on his knees. He had heard stories like Pike's 100 times before. They were almost always a prelude to a land grab or an excuse to exterminate a local tribe. "So, you are telling me, Mr. Pike," O'Rourke said when the landowner had finished, his voice calm and even, "that this Chief Kohana is planning to violate a truce that he himself proposed." "It is a trick," Pike insisted, leaning forward earnestly. "They are biding their time, gathering their strength. They are right next to the new railroad survey line. It is a threat to progress. Sergeant, a threat to national security." "The railroad," O'Rourke repeated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes, your railroad." He stood up, the interview clearly over. "Thank you for bringing this to my attention. Mr. Pike, I will look into the matter." Pike left the fort feeling a surge of confidence, mistaking the sergeant's professional courtesy for agreement. He did not understand that a man like O'Rourke did not act on the frantic words of a man with a clear financial stake in the conflict. O'Rourke would investigate, and Pike, in his arrogance, decided to give the sergeant something to find. The new railroad tracks were a raw, ugly scar on the landscape, a steel serpent winding its way west. A section of the track ran on a low trestle over the same creek that flowed from Blanca Canyon, less than a mile from the contested watering hole. It was the perfect stage. An attack there could be seen as an assault on the United States itself. Pike summoned his railroad foreman, a hard man named Jennings with experience in blasting rock. The instructions were simple: place a small charge under the trestle, just enough to splinter some timbers and twist a rail. It had to look like primitive sabotage, the work of Indians who feared the iron horse. A few days later, under the oppressive heat of the midday sun, Eliza and Maria Ortega made their way toward the creek. Maria carried a basket, hoping to find willow bark and other herbs that grew in the relative dampness near the water. Since the confrontation at the canyon, Eliza had been living in a strange limbo. She could not bring herself to speak to her father, who spent his days in a drunken stupor. The ranch felt like a tomb. Being with Maria was a comfort, a connection to a world that was not defined by shame and debt. They walked along the creek bed, the shadow of the railroad trestle falling over them. Eliza looked up at the massive wooden beams and the twin ribbons of steel shining in the sun. It was a symbol of the future, a thing of power and relentless force. It promised to connect them to the rest of the world, but it also felt like an invasion, a loud, violent reshaping of the land she knew. They were 100 yards past the trestle when the world exploded. The ground bucked beneath their feet. A deafening, gut-wrenching roar ripped through the air, followed an instant later by the shriek of tortured metal and splintering wood. Eliza instinctively threw herself over Maria, pushing them both down behind a rocky outcrop as a shower of dirt, stones, and hot metal fragments rained down around them. A geyser of fire and black smoke billowed up from the trestle, a monstrous blossom of destruction. Pike's plan had gone spectacularly wrong. The charge, perhaps miscalculated by Jennings or set with a faulty fuse, had been far more powerful than intended. It did not just damage the trestle, it obliterated a section of it, sending a massive support beam cartwheeling into the air and starting a fire in the dry brush. The explosion also destabilized the rocky cliffside 100 yards away, the very cliffside where Eliza and Maria were huddled. With a deep groan, the rock face began to fracture. From a ridge overlooking the canyon, Kohana and 2 of his warriors saw the smoke and heard the blast. They had been watching the railroad crew for days, their presence a quiet, vigilant observation. The truce was with the ranchers, not the iron horse, and they did not trust the men who were scarring the earth. When they saw the explosion, their first thought was not of war, but of the two women they had seen walking along the creek. As Eliza helped a terrified Maria to her feet, the rumbling from the cliff grew louder. Rocks began to tumble down, starting a small but growing landslide directly in their path back to the ranch. They were trapped. Panic began to set in, a cold, sharp fear that threatened to paralyze them. It was then that they saw them. 3 figures, moving with the impossible speed and grace of mountain cats, were coming down the opposite slope. It was Kohana and his men. They were not charging with war cries. They were running to help. "This way," Kohana shouted, his voice cutting through the roar of the fire and the crashing of rocks. Quickly, Eliza did not hesitate. Grabbing Maria's hand, she pulled the older woman along, scrambling over the uneven ground toward their rescuers. The air was thick with choking smoke, and the heat from the fire was intense. Pike's hired men, who had been waiting nearby to discover the sabotage, now appeared on the ridge, rifles in hand. Seeing the Apache, they immediately opened fire, their bullets kicking up dust around Eliza and Kohana. The world devolved into a terrifying chaos of noise, smoke, and danger. Kohana reached them, grabbing Maria's other arm and practically lifting her over a set of boulders. One of his warriors laid down covering fire with a Winchester, his shots precise and deliberate, forcing Pike's men to take cover. As they scrambled up the slope to safety, a piece of shrapnel from the exploded track, flung an impossible distance, ricocheted off a rock. Eliza cried out, a sharp, hot pain lancing through her left forearm. She stumbled, but Kohana's grip on her was firm, pulling her forward. They reached the cover of the ridge just as the wind, which had been stirring all day, rose to a sudden howl. The sky turned a sickly yellow as a scouring wall of sand and grit swept across the canyon. A sudden, violent sandstorm that blotted out the sun and reduced visibility to near zero. The storm that had added to the terror was now their salvation. At that same moment, Sergeant O'Rourke was riding toward the Hart Ranch. Pike's frantic report, combined with his own instincts, had prompted him to see the situation for himself. He was still 2 miles away when he saw the column of black smoke rise into the sky. He spurred his horse into a gallop. He arrived to find a scene of utter pandemonium. The fire was spreading, and the sandstorm was descending. Avery Pike and Sheriff Doolin were already there, shouting over the wind. "You see?" Sergeant Pike bellowed, his face a mask of triumphant fury. "Just as I told you, they have started a war. They have attacked the railroad." O'Rourke ignored him. Dismounting, he handed his reins to the sheriff and strode toward the wreckage, his coat pulled up over his nose and mouth to ward off the stinging sand. He was a professional assessing a battlefield. His trained eyes took in the crater, the pattern of the blast, the nature of the damage. It was powerful, too powerful for a thrown bundle of dynamite. This was a deliberate, well-placed charge. As Pike continued to rave about Apache savagery, O'Rourke knelt in the crater. The sand was already beginning to fill it in, but his fingers found something. He brushed the grit away. It was a small, brass percussion cap, the kind used to detonate a blasting charge. Attached to it was a small fragment of a distinct, waterproof fuse. He had seen hundreds like it. It was not military issue. It was not something a prospector would have. It was a specific type of detonator used almost exclusively by the large, well-supplied crews of the Union Pacific Railroad. He closed his fist around the small, damning piece of evidence. He stood up and looked at Pike, who was still shouting about justice and revenge, and Sergeant O'Rourke, a man who believed in facts over fear, knew that the story of this day's violence was not the one Avery Pike was telling. Hidden in a shallow cave, shielded from the fury of the sandstorm, Kohana gently tore a strip of cloth from his own shirt. He carefully cleaned the long, shallow gash on Eliza's forearm. She winced, but sat perfectly still, her trust in him absolute. The wound was not deep, but it bled freely, a bright red mark of her initiation into a war she had never wanted. The fire was out of sight. The gunshots had ceased, and for a moment, In the howling darkness of the storm, there was only the quiet, focused calm of one person caring for another. The storm died as quickly as it had been born. Its fury spent, it left behind a world scoured clean and unnaturally silent, the air tasting of rain and wet dust. In the small cave, the three of them were a pocket of stillness in the vast, unsettled landscape. Kohana finished tying the bandage on Eliza's arm, his touch gentle but firm. He met her eyes, and in their depths, she saw not a victor, but a man burdened by the violence that had just occurred. "Pike's men will be searching," he said, his voice low. "They will not look for you on our land. It is the one place you will be safe. You and your friend must come with us." Maria, who had been huddled in a corner, pale and shaken, nodded her agreement without hesitation. For Eliza, the decision was just as simple. Returning to the ranch, to the empty shell of a home lorded over by her father's ghosts, was unthinkable. The world of Avery Pike and false accusations held nothing for her but danger. She was adrift, and the only hand offered to her was Kohana's. She gave a single, decisive nod. Their journey to the Chiricahua camp. The rancheria was a silent trek through a labyrinth of canyons and hidden trails that did not appear on any map. It was a place designed to be unseen. When they arrived, Eliza saw not the chaotic, primitive village of her imagination, but a settlement of quiet order. Wickiups, domed shelters made of brush and hides, were arranged in a natural clearing near a protected spring. The air smelled of wood smoke, roasting agave, and horses. Children stopped their play to stare with wide, curious eyes. Women paused their work, their expressions guarded but not hostile. They looked to Kohana, their trust in his judgment absolute. He spoke to an older woman in their own language, her weathered face kind, and she immediately came forward to lead Maria to a wickiup to rest. The next few days passed in a haze of healing and quiet observation. Eliza's arm ached, but the wound was clean and mending. She was a guest, an outsider, but she was not treated as a prisoner. She was given food, water, and space. But idleness was not in her nature. She began to watch, to learn the rhythms of the camp. She saw how they used every part of a kill, how the women could read the future of the weather in the shape of a cloud or the behavior of ants. An elder, the same one who had taken Maria in, showed her how to find the water stored in the roots of a soapweed yucca, how to weave its fibers into cordage stronger than any rope she had ever used. It was a language of survival, spoken not with words but with hands and an intimate knowledge of the earth. The children, their initial shyness overcome by curiosity, began to follow her. One afternoon, sitting in the shade, she took a piece of charcoal from a dead fire and began to draw on a flat, smooth rock. She drew a horse, then a hawk. The children gathered closer, fascinated. Then she drew a letter, an A, then a B. She spoke the sounds aloud. They copied her, their small fingers clumsy in the dirt. An impromptu school had begun. Each day, she would spend an hour teaching them her letters and numbers, and in return, they would bring her things: a shiny pebble, a bird's feather, a strange, sweet fruit she had never seen before. It was a simple, unspoken exchange, a reciprocity of knowledge, a building of trust, one letter, one gift at a time. As the sun set, the camp would come together. The fires would be lit, casting a warm, dancing glow on the faces of the families. The smell of cooking meat would fill the air. It was in these moments that Eliza felt her own loneliness most acutely. She was among people, yet utterly alone, a ghost from another world. One evening, as the stars began to poke holes in the velvet darkness of the sky, Kohana came and sat on the ground near her. He offered her a piece of roasted rabbit. For a while, they ate in a comfortable silence, listening to the murmur of conversation and the laughter of the children. "You are a good teacher," he said finally. "They learn quickly from you." "They are smart children," Eliza replied, looking over at the small group still practicing their letters in the dust. "And I have nothing else to give." "You give your knowledge. That is a great gift. he said. He looked into the fire, his face serious. My people have stories. They are our way of remembering who we are. I think sometimes your people forget your stories. Eliza thought of her father, lost in his bottle, and Avery Pike, lost in his greed. Maybe we have the wrong ones, she said softly. The conversation opened a door between them. In the quiet evenings that followed, they began to talk, not just of the truce or the threat of Pike, but of their lives. He told her of his name, that it meant swift or agile, a name given to him after he had outrun a wild horse as a boy. She, in turn, told him her own name meant pledge to God, a name that felt foreign to her now, a pledge made in a church she no longer attended. One night, when the moon was a sliver of silver in the sky, the conversation turned deeper. He spoke of the past, of the time before the forts and the railroads, but he also spoke of the wars. He told her how his father, the previous chief, and his mother had been killed during a raid by soldiers, an attack that was a reprisal for something they had not done. He spoke without hatred, but with a profound and weary sadness, the sorrow of a man who had been forced to lead his people through endless loss. Hearing his story, Eliza found the courage to share her own. She spoke of her mother, a woman of quiet strength, taken by a fever that had swept through the territory 5 years prior. She described how her father, unable to bear the weight of his grief, had slowly given himself over to whiskey, how the strong, capable man she had adored had faded away, leaving a hollow, resentful stranger in his place. It was the first time she had spoken of it aloud, and the act of sharing the burden, of having it heard with quiet understanding, was a release. They were from different worlds, their losses inflicted by different hands, but their grief was the same language. We cannot change what is behind us, Kohana said, his voice a low murmur in the darkness. We can only choose the path we walk now, and we must walk it with open eyes. No more secrets, Eliza whispered, and it felt like a vow. No more lies. But with this growing intimacy came a new kind of conflict, an internal one. Eliza would find herself looking at her own hands, so pale against the dark earth, and feel a pang of dislocation. Was she betraying her own people by finding a home here? Could she ever truly belong? She was a heart from a world of fences and deeds and ledger books. This was a world of open land and shared resources, of different spirits and different rules. The comfort she felt here was shadowed by a sense of disloyalty, a fear that she was losing a part of herself she could never get back. Kohana, too, felt the weight of their connection. He saw the way his people were beginning to accept her, the way the children flocked to her. He saw the respect in the eyes of his warriors, but he also saw the danger. She was a flashpoint. Her presence among them, should it become widely known, could be the very spark Pike needed to bring the army down upon them. His heart was drawn to her strength and her courage, but his duty as a leader was to his people's safety. To care for her was to endanger them all. The thought was a constant, heavy stone in his gut. Their unspoken feelings surfaced in small, unguarded moments. One afternoon, they were working together, stretching a wet deer hide on a wooden frame to dry. The task required them to pull and tie the ropes on opposite sides, working in tandem. As they both reached for the same length of rope to tighten a corner, their hands brushed. It was a simple, fleeting contact, but a jolt of electricity passed between them, a sudden, sharp awareness that was more than just friendship. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. They both saw the same surprise, the same question, the same deep and complex emotion mirrored in the other's gaze. Kohana pulled his hand back slowly, a muscle tightening in his jaw. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. Neither of them spoke of it. The boundary was there, unseen but respected. There was too much between them, too much history and too much danger to cross it. Later that day, Eliza was trying to master a particularly difficult knot used to secure a wiki-up's flap against the wind. Her fingers, accustomed to a needle and thread, fumbled with the thick hide rope. Frustrated, she sighed. "I write better than I tie knots," she said, more to herself than to anyone else. Kohana, who had been watching her from a short distance, smiled. He walked over and took the rope, his long, deft fingers forming the intricate knot in a few swift movements. "Knots can tie the wind," he said, his voice gentle, a hint of laughter in it. "Words can tie people." Eliza looked from the perfectly tied knot to his face, and in that moment, she understood. They were learning to tie their worlds together. He was teaching her the knots that held his world secure against the storm, and she was teaching his children the words that would help them navigate the one to come. It was a fragile, dangerous beginning, but it was real, and for the first time since her mother's death, she felt the tentative, hopeful pull of a rope that was not a tether, but a lifeline. Word of Eliza Hart's presence in the Chiricahua camp spread through the territory like a grass fire. It was a story twisted and embellished with every telling, a seed of rumor that Avery Pike cultivated with malicious care. He needed the town's fear. He needed their outrage. With Sergeant O'Rourke's investigation into the railroad explosion proceeding with methodical slowness, Pike's grip on the narrative was slipping. He decided to seize it back in the one place where his power was absolute, the smoky, whiskey-soaked confines of his own saloon. The place was crowded, filled with dusty ranchers, railroad men, and prospectors, all of them thirsty and susceptible to the poison of a good story. Pike stood at the bar, a bottle in one hand, a glass in the other. He had an audience. In a corner, slumped over a small table, was Silas Hart, a ghost haunting the scene of his own damnation. He was unshaven, his eyes vacant, a permanent fixture of shame that Pike found useful. Pike slammed his glass on the bar, demanding silence. The low murmur of conversations died down. Every eye turned to him. "You all wonder what is happening out at Blanca Canyon," Pike's voice boomed, rich with false concern. "You have heard the rumors. I am here to tell you the truth." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Building the drama." He pointed a thick finger toward the corner where Silas sat. "Ask him. Ask Silas Hart. He knows the truth." Silas looked up, his eyes struggling to focus. He seemed confused, a puppet whose strings were tangled. Pike's voice dropped to a conspiratorial roar, a pronouncement meant to sound like a secret finally being ripped into the light. It was a carefully crafted sentence, each word chosen to inflame, to shame, and to incite. Her father sold the virgin to the Apache chief. He paid the price and made her his queen. The words hung in the thick air, ugly and potent. Pike let them sink in, a malicious grin spreading across his face. He was painting a picture of barbarism and dishonor. A father selling his own child, a young woman debased, made a savage's plaything. He was stoking the deepest fears and prejudices of every man in the room. "That is right, is it not?" Silas Pike pressed, his voice dripping with mock pity. "You made a deal with the devil to save your own worthless hide." Silas, lost in his alcoholic fog, gave a slow, miserable nod. It was a confirmation born of utter brokenness, but to the men watching, it was an admission of guilt. A low, angry growl rumbled through the crowd. Men turned to each other, their faces hardening. Pike had his mob. At that exact moment, the bat-wing doors of the saloon swung inward. The sudden flood of harsh afternoon sunlight made every man turn and squint. A figure stood silhouetted against the bright dust of the street. As he stepped inside, a collective gasp went through the room. It was Nantan Kohana. He was alone. He wore no war paint. He carried his rifle pointed toward the floor in a sign of peace. He moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that was more intimidating than any threat. The angry murmuring died instantly, replaced by a tense, shocked silence. Men instinctively reached for the pistols at their hips, but no one drew. There was an authority about Kohana that held them frozen, an unnerving calm in the face of their collective hostility. He ignored the armed men. He ignored Avery Pike's look of pure, murderous rage. His gaze swept the room once. Then he walked directly to the main poker table in the center of the room. From a pouch at his belt, he took out two objects and placed them carefully on the dusty wood. The first was a heavy leather bag that clinked with the sound of silver coins. Beside it, he placed a bundle of carefully wrapped herbs and medicinal roots, a small fortune in potent, traditional remedies. The second object was a piece of paper, folded neatly. Kohana's voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the silence like a knife. He looked not at Pike, but at the crowd. The iron rail exploded. He said, his voice even, "Some of your people were frightened. Some may have been hurt by the fire. This is a payment for that trouble." He gestured to the bag and the herbs. "It is the price for the fear that was caused. It is a gesture of peace between our communities." He had taken Pike's word, price, and redefined it. This was not the price for a person. It was restitution. It was the responsible action of a leader trying to prevent a war, not start one. He then unfolded the paper. "This is the agreement for the water, signed by me, and witnessed by your soldier, Sergeant O'Rourke of Fort Grant." He held it up so they could see the bold signature at the bottom. "It is an agreement between equals, to share what the land gives us. There is no other agreement. There is no other price." The men in the saloon stared, their minds struggling to reconcile this calm presentation of facts with the lurid story Pike had just told them. The foundation of their outrage was beginning to crumble. Before Pike could find his voice to counter, the saloon doors opened again. Eliza Hart stepped inside. If Kohana's entrance had been a shock, hers was a thunderclap. She was not disheveled or broken. She wore her own simple dress, and her hair was tied back neatly. Her face was pale, but resolute. The yucca bracelet was still on her wrist. She walked past the stunned faces of her neighbors and came to stand beside the central table, a full partner in the confrontation. She looked directly at Pike, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. Then she turned her gaze to the crowd, to the men she had known her entire life. "No one sold me," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with an unshakable conviction. "My father made a terrible choice out of fear, mister. Pike told a lie out of greed, but my life was not part of their bargain." Her eyes found the pathetic form of her father in the corner, and for a moment, a flicker of pain crossed her face. She looked back at the crowd. "I am not a hostage. I am not a queen. I am a free woman. I choose who I walk with." The saloon was utterly silent. The simple, powerful truth of her words, combined with Kohana's evidence, had completely disarmed them. The ugly story Pike had woven dissolved into the cheap lie it had always been. Avery Pike's face was a mask of apoplectic fury. He saw his control, his power, his entire scheme collapsing. "She is bewitched by them," he roared, trying to reignite the flames. "She is a traitor to her own kind." "The only traitor here, Mr. Pike," a new voice said from the doorway, "is the man who lies to start a war." Sergeant Miles O'Rourke stepped into the room, two armed soldiers flanking him. His calm, authoritative presence was the final nail in Pike's coffin. "I have a signed document of peace here," O'Rourke said, nodding toward the paper in Kohana's hand. "And I have a detonator cap from the railroad explosion that was made for a railroad crew." His eyes, as cold and blue as a winter sky, locked onto Pike's. "I am conducting an official United States Army investigation into the matter. I would advise everyone in this room to think very carefully about which side of that investigation they want to be on." The threat was unmistakable. The authority in the room had shifted, from the mob rule of a wealthy bully to the impartial power of the law. The men in the crowd began to shuffle their feet, avoiding Pike's gaze. They were no longer a mob. They were just men in a bar who had been made fools of. Eliza looked at Kohana. In the middle of this hostile, dangerous place, they stood together, two people from different worlds, bound not by a sordid transaction, but by a shared commitment to the truth. The word queen, which Pike had spat as a slur, now seemed to mean something else entirely. It was not about a crown or a throne. It was about the simple, regal dignity of a person who refused to be owned. Avery Pike was a man being squeezed. Sergeant O'Rourke's methodical investigation was a slow, crushing pressure, and the public humiliation in the saloon had stripped him of his local authority. He was a cornered predator, and that made him more dangerous than ever. His mind, stripped of its veneer of civilized business, reverted to a more primitive logic. If he could not control the narrative with lies, he would create a new one with violence. He needed a crisis so immediate and personal that it would override everything else. He needed a lever to force Eliza Hart's hand. He found that lever in the pathetic, drunken form of her father. It was pathetically easy. Pike's men found Silas Hart passed out behind the saloon, a common enough occurrence. They simply loaded him onto a horse like a sack of grain and rode out of town under the cover of darkness. No one noticed. No one cared. Silas had become invisible. The message arrived the next day, delivered by a grim-faced railroad worker to Maria Ortega's small adobe house. He thrust a crumpled piece of paper into her hand and rode off without a word. Maria's hands trembled as she read the crude scrawl. Her face ashen, she made the difficult journey to the Chiricahua Rancheria. She found Eliza helping the women grind mesquite beans into flour. The peaceful, domestic scene was shattered the moment Maria held out the note. Eliza took it, her heart turning to a cold, heavy stone in her chest as she read the words. I have your father. Meet me at sundown in the stone maze west of the trestle. Come alone. If the chief or his warriors are with you, the old man dies. Your choice. It was a trap. A blatant, clumsy, but undeniably effective trap. He was using the last shred of her familial duty as a lure. Kohana was with her in moments, his face grim as he read the note over her shoulder. His hand instinctively went to the hilt of his knife. He is a fool, Kohana said, his voice a low growl. He thinks he can draw us out into the open? I will take my warriors. We will find him before sundown. No, Eliza said, her voice quiet but firm. She looked up at him, her eyes filled with a terrible resolve. The note says I must come alone. If he sees you, he will kill my father. It is what he will do anyway. Eliza, Kohana argued, his voice softening slightly. This is not about your father. This is about silencing you and me. He wants to finish what he started at the railroad. I know, she said, her throat tight, but he is still my father. I cannot leave him to die. I will not. This was her burden to bear, the final, bitter fruit of her family's collapse. She had to see it through. Their argument was cut short by a sudden change in the air. A low moan of wind began to stir the dust in the camp. The sky to the west was turning a bruised, sickly yellow. The birds fell silent. The older Apache began to move with a quiet urgency, securing the flaps of their wickiups, gathering the children. A sandstorm was coming, a great, scouring wall of wind and earth. The storm did not change Eliza's mind. It hardened it. I am going, she stated, her jaw set. Kohana looked from her determined face to the monstrous, approaching cloud of dust. He saw the futility of arguing with her. He also saw the raw courage that had drawn him to her from the very beginning. He respected her will, even if it led them into the heart of danger. He made a different choice. He would not stop her. He would go with her, not as a warrior charging into battle, but as a guide through the chaos. You will not go alone, he said, but we will not go as he expects. The storm is our shield. He called out a few sharp commands in his own tongue. 3 of his best scouts appeared at his side, their faces calm and ready. They were men who could read a broken twig in the dark, who could follow a trail across bare rock. A sandstorm was just another kind of terrain to them. They prepared quickly. Each of them, including Eliza, wrapped a strip of cloth over their nose and mouth, a simple mask against the stinging grit. The symbol was not lost on Eliza. To see clearly in the coming blindness, they first had to cover a part of themselves. As the first fierce gusts of wind hit the camp, the small party of 5 slipped out into the howling twilight, melting into the yellow gloom. Navigating the storm was like moving through a nightmare. The wind shrieked, a physical force that tore at their clothes and pushed them back. Sand filled the air, a thick, blinding fog that reduced visibility to a few feet and stung any exposed skin. But Kohana and his men were in their element. They moved by instinct, by the feel of the ground under their feet, by an internal map that no storm could erase. They did not fight the wind, they flowed with it, using gullies and rock formations for cover, their movements economical and sure. They reached the area Pike had designated a confusing labyrinth of tall, wind-carved rock formations as the last of the light was devoured by the storm. Pike and his half-dozen men were hunkered down in a small box canyon, using the rock walls as a windbreak. They had a large fire going, its light a faint, struggling glow in the maelstrom. Silas' heart was tied to a rock near the flames, a terrified, shivering wreck. Kohana held up a hand, bringing his small party to a halt on the ridge overlooking the canyon. They could hear Pike's men shouting to one another over the howl of the wind, their nerves frayed by the storm and the waiting. Kohana did not plan a direct assault. That was Pike's clumsy way. He planned to use the storm itself as a weapon. He gave his instructions in a series of quiet words and hand signals. 2 of his scouts disappeared into the swirling dust. A few minutes later, a new light flickered to life on the far side of the canyon. A small fire. A decoy. One of Pike's men saw it and shouted, pointing, "Over there I see something." Several of them raised their rifles and fired blindly into the storm, their shots swallowed by the wind. Then a new sound began, a high, eerie cry that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was one of Kohana's scouts, cupping his hands to his mouth, throwing his voice so that the canyon walls caught it, amplified it, and echoed it back in a dozen different directions. Pike's men spun around, their eyes wide with fear, trying to find the source of the phantom sound. While they were distracted, Kohana and Eliza began their descent into the canyon, using a path that was little more than a goat trail. The 3rd scout remained on the ridge, a silent overwatch. The chaos escalated. A second decoy fire flared up, this time closer, drawing more panicked, useless gunfire. The ghostly howls continued, seeming to mock them from the heart of the storm. Pike's men were completely disoriented, firing at shadows, their discipline collapsing into raw fear. "Hold your fire, you fools!" Pike bellowed. But his voice was just one more sound in the cacophony. Using the confusion as cover, Kohana and Eliza reached the canyon floor. They moved like shadows along the rock wall, the wind masking the sound of their footsteps. They were 10 yards from Silas when one of Pike's men finally saw them, his face appearing like a pale mask in the swirling dust. He opened his mouth to shout a warning. He never made a sound. An arrow, fired from the scout on the ridge above, sprouted from his chest. He collapsed without a cry. The Apache did not kill needlessly, but they protected their own with lethal efficiency. In the next instant, Kohana was on the 2 men guarding Silas. He moved with a brutal, contained violence, using his knife and the weight of his body to disable them both before they could even raise their weapons. Eliza ran to her father, her own knife flashing in the firelight as she sawed through the ropes that bound him. Silas stumbled to his feet, his eyes wild with terror and a dawning, uncomprehending relief. He looked at his daughter, at the fierce, determined woman who had walked into the heart of a storm for him. The dam of his shame finally broke. "Ellie," he sobbed, his voice lost in the wind. "I am so sorry for everything. I am sorry." There was no time for absolution. Eliza grabbed his arm, pulling him back toward the shadows. "We have to go now!" Pike, finally realizing what was happening, let out a roar of pure fury and fired his pistol into the darkness where they had disappeared. The bullet ricocheted off the rock wall, yards from its target. Kohana and his scout returned fire, not to kill, but to keep their heads down. As Eliza dragged her father back up the treacherous path, They regrouped on the ridge as the storm began, at last, to abate. The wind lessened, and the thick curtain of sand began to thin. Below them, Pike's force was shattered, 2 men down and the rest terrified and unwilling to pursue them into the darkness. The rescue was complete. As the first stars began to appear in the newly washed sky, they saw another group of riders approaching. It was Sergeant O'Rourke and his soldiers, with a very reluctant Sheriff Doolin in tow. They had been tracking Pike all day. O'Rourke took in the scene with a practiced eye the disheveled state of Pike's men, the injured, the clear evidence of a failed ambush. He saw Eliza and the rescued Silas. His gaze rested on Sheriff Doolin, who looked like he was about to be sick. "Looks like I missed the party," O'Rourke said, his voice dry. One of the young Apache warriors, his face still streaked with dust, looked at the sheriff, who was already starting to edge his horse away from the scene. The warrior grinned. "That sheriff," he said to his companion, "just loud enough to be heard. He runs faster than a horse." Sergeant O'Rourke overheard him. A corner of his sun-bleached mustache twitched. He turned his cool blue eyes on the lawman. "I only run," he said, his voice carrying a distinct warning, "when I am in pursuit of justice." Avery Pike was out of time, and he knew it. The failed kidnapping had been a disaster, exposing him as a desperate fool and solidifying Sergeant O'Rourke's suspicions. The Army sergeant was now a constant, quiet threat, his investigation methodically tightening like a noose. Pike's web of lies was shredded. His reputation in town was in tatters, and his plans to seize the Hart Ranch and its water were turning to dust. A man like Pike, stripped of his power and facing ruin, does not surrender. He burns the world down. His final, desperate gambit centered on the symbol of the very progress he claimed to champion, the new railroad bridge. It was a magnificent wooden trestle spanning the wide and dry wash a mile downstream from the canyon, a testament to engineering and ambition. Beside it, in a small, well-guarded shed, was the railroad company's entire supply of blasting powder and dynamite, enough explosives to level a small mountain. If that shed were to explode, taking the bridge with it, the act would be so catastrophic, so undeniably an act of war, that the Army would have no choice but to retaliate with overwhelming force. The Apache would be blamed, the truce would be forgotten, and in the ensuing chaos, a man like Avery Pike could rewrite his own story. He gathered the last of his loyal men, those whose fortunes were tied so tightly to his that they would sink with him. They were hard men, paid well for their lack of conscience. The plan was set for that night, under the cold light of a full moon. But the town was no longer Pike's silent accomplice. The events in the saloon had planted a seed of doubt that had grown into a quiet rebellion of conscience. A stable hand who had overheard Pike's hushed, angry orders to his foreman sought out Maria Ortega. A shopkeeper who had sold an unusual amount of lamp oil to Pike's men remembered Sergeant O'Rourke's cold, assessing eyes. Whispers moved through the dusty streets, whispers that finally reached the ears of O'Rourke himself. The disparate forces of justice converged at the Hart Ranch as dusk began to bleed across the sky. Sergeant O'Rourke arrived with 4 soldiers and a small, determined group of deputized townsmen, their faces grim. Kohana was already there with his 3 scouts, having been alerted by the unusual activity of Pike's men near the bridge. Eliza and Silas stood on the porch, caught in the eye of the storm they had helped create. "He is going to do it tonight," O'Rourke said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "My source says he is planning to blow the explosives shed. He wants to take out the bridge and blame it on the Apache." "It will be a massacre," Kohana said, his voice a low rumble. "The Army will not ask questions after something like that. Which is why we have to stop him before he lights the fuse," O'Rourke concluded. They formed a hasty plan, a pincer movement born of necessity. O'Rourke and his men would approach from the east, along the railroad tracks. Kohana and his scouts would use their knowledge of the terrain to circle around and come in from the west, trapping Pike's men on the bridge itself. "There is a problem," Eliza said, her voice cutting through the men's strategic talk. Everyone turned to look at her. The shed is close to the trestle. If a firefight starts, a stray bullet could set the whole thing off. You cannot just charge in." "She is right," Silas added, his voice raspy but clear, sober for the first time in what felt like years. "He will use the explosives as a shield." Eliza's mind was racing. She thought of Sarah Miller, the widow of a railroad blasting foreman who had been killed the previous year. Eliza had spent weeks helping the grieving woman, listening as she talked endlessly about her husband's work, describing in meticulous, heartbreaking detail the mechanisms of fuses, blasting caps, and detonators. In her grief, Sarah had unknowingly armed Eliza with a dangerous and vital knowledge. "The detonators," Eliza said, thinking aloud. "They will have run a wire from the shed to a plunger box. If I can get to the wires under the bridge, I might be able to cut them before they can trigger the charge." The men stared at her. The idea was insane. "Absolutely not," O'Rourke said immediately. "It is the only way," Eliza insisted, her gaze unwavering. "You can create a distraction, but someone has to stop the explosion at its source. I know how it works. I can do it." Kohana looked at her, his dark eyes searching her face. He saw no fear, only a fierce, focused determination. He saw the same woman who had held a knife to her captor, the same woman who had walked into a saloon full of enemies. He trusted her. "We will create your distraction," Kohana said, his voice a quiet affirmation that settled the argument. The world beneath the railroad trestle was a cathedral of shadows and crossbeams, a complex web of wood and steel. High above, Eliza could hear the low voices of Pike's men as they worked on the bridge deck. Below, the dry creek bed was a river of moonlight. She moved like a spider, her fingers and feet finding holds in the massive structure, the splinters of the raw lumber digging into her palms. The skills she had learned climbing the canyon rocks now served her in this man-made wilderness. She carried her father's old wire cutters in her belt, the cold steel a reassuring weight against her hip. She found them, 2 thin copper wires, gleaming faintly in the moonlight, running from the explosives shed to a small wooden box with a plunger handle, set up 100 feet away on the bridge deck. Pike and his men were making their final preparations. Suddenly, a shout rang out from the east. O'Rourke and his men had been spotted. The firefight began, the sharp crack of rifles echoing through the night. It was the distraction she needed. As gunfire erupted above, Eliza pulled herself onto a narrow support beam directly beneath the tracks. She pulled out the wire cutters. Her heart hammered against her ribs. One stray bullet, one spark, and she and everything around her would be vaporized. On the bridge deck, chaos reigned. Kohana and his scouts appeared from the western shadows, their movements swift and silent. They engaged Pike's men, using the wooden structure for cover, their actions precise and coordinated. It was not a battle of volleys, but a series of brutal, close-quarters skirmishes. Kohana found himself face to face with Jennings, Pike's hulking foreman. The man was a brute, swinging his rifle like a club. Kohana sidestepped the clumsy attack, the butt of the rifle splintering the wood where his head had been. He did not draw his pistol. He met the man's brute force with speed and leverage, a whirlwind of motion that ended with Jennings disarmed and flat on his back. The wind knocked out of him. Kohana stood over him, his knife in his hand, but he did not strike. He had won. That was enough. Below, Eliza took a deep breath and reached for the wires. A bullet whizzed past her head, fired from above, and she flattened herself against the beam. Looking up, she saw one of Pike's men leaning over the side, aiming his pistol directly at her. Time seemed to slow down. She saw the flash from the pistol's muzzle. She heard the shot, but she did not feel the impact. A shape had thrown itself in front of her. It was her father. Silas had followed them, a desperate need for redemption driving him. He had scrambled under the trestle after her, and now he stood on the beam beside her, a dark stain spreading across his shoulder as he grunted in pain. He had taken the bullet meant for her. The gunman above cursed and raised his pistol again. but an arrow from one of Kohana's scouts silenced him permanently. "Cut the wire!" "Ellie!" Silas gasped, clutching his shoulder. "Do it now!" Her hands shaking. Eliza put the cutters to the first wire. It snapped with a dull metallic sound. She moved to the second. On the bridge, Avery Pike saw his plan disintegrating. His men were being overrun. He ran to the plunger box, his face a mask of insane fury. If he was going down, he was taking everyone with him. "It is over!" Pike Sergeant O'Rourke shouted, his own pistol aimed at the landowner's chest. "Not until I say it is," Pike screamed, and he slammed his hand down on the plunger. Nothing happened. Eliza, below, had just snipped the second wire. She watched the severed ends fall away into the darkness. A shuddering wave of relief so powerful it almost made her lose her grip washed over her. Pike stared at the useless plunger box in disbelief. That moment of stunned inaction was all O'Rourke needed. His soldiers and the townsmen swarmed forward, and Avery Pike was finally taken into custody, his insane screams of rage echoing into the night. Sheriff Doolin, who had been cowering behind a supply wagon, tried to step forward and assert his authority, but O'Rourke simply held up the detonator cap he had found after the first explosion. It matched the ones in Pike's possession perfectly. "Your authority is no longer recognized here." "Sheriff," O'Rourke said, his voice as cold as steel. The fight was over. The silence that descended was broken only by the groans of the wounded and the quiet words of the victors. The townspeople who had come with O'Rourke stared at the scene, at the captured Pike, at the evidence of his treachery. They looked at Eliza and her wounded father being helped from beneath the trestle by Kohana. The vicious, slanderous headline Pike had screamed in the saloon had been definitively answered. The truth was laid bare for all to see, illuminated by the cold, impartial light of the moon. The bridge stood, not as a monument to destruction, but as a silent witness, a potential connection between two shores, waiting for a future that had, against all odds, just been saved. The aftermath of the battle on the bridge settled over the territory, bringing not peace, but a period of stark and sober reckoning. The machinery of frontier justice, often slow and arbitrary, moved with uncharacteristic speed, propelled by the authority of the United States Army. The trial of Avery Pike was not a grand affair held in a formal courtroom, but a swift and decisive hearing in the town's small, stuffy meeting hall. A traveling circuit judge, a stern man with a hawkish nose and no patience for theatrics, presided. The evidence was irrefutable. Sergeant O'Rourke laid it out with military precision, the detonator cap from the first explosion. A perfect match for the crate of detonators found in Pike's possession, the sworn testimony of the townsmen who had fought alongside him on the bridge, the confession of Pike's foreman, Jennings, who, facing a hangman's noose, chose to save his own neck by sacrificing his employers. Avery Pike stood in chains, but he was not bowed. He was arrogant and defiant to the end, spewing accusations of treason and conspiracy, his voice echoing in the silent hall. But his words were hollow, the ravings of a king whose kingdom had been reduced to a 6-by-6-foot jail cell. The judge listened impassively before delivering the sentence. Pike was convicted of attempted murder, destruction of federal property, and inciting armed conflict. He was to be transported to the territorial prison at Yuma, a place from which few men returned. Sheriff Doolin's fate was less dramatic, but just as final. He stood before the judge, a weeping, broken man, and was stripped of his badge and his office in a quiet ceremony of public disgrace. He shuffled out of the hall, a free man, but one condemned to live with the contempt of his neighbors for the rest of his days. With the lies purged and the guilty condemned, a space was cleared for a new beginning. A week later, a formal ceremony was held to sign the new water treaty. A simple wooden table was set up in the town square, a neutral ground for a historic accord. Sergeant O'Rourke, his duty as an investigator complete, now acted as an official witness for the United States government. Kohana arrived not with warriors, but with the elders of his tribe, their presence a solemn endorsement of the peace to come. Eliza Hart stood as the other signatory, not as her father's daughter, but as the legal owner of the Hart Ranch. She represented herself and her land. The treaty was read aloud for all to hear. It was a document of profound and simple wisdom. It detailed the hours of the day each community could draw water, ensuring enough for all. But it went further. It established rules for grazing, preventing the delicate grasslands around the creek from being turned to dust. It was a pact not just of sharing, but of preservation, a promise to be custodians of the land that sustained them both. Kohana made his mark, a bold, confident symbol. Eliza dipped the pen in the inkwell and signed her name. Eliza Hart. The letters clear and strong. A quiet, respectful applause rippled through the crowd of townspeople who had gathered to watch. The piece of paper was more than an agreement. It was a bridge, built not of wood and steel, but of truth and mutual respect. That evening, back at the ranch, another transfer of ownership took place. The house was quiet, the air clean of the old ghosts of whiskey and despair. Silas's arm was in a clean sling. The bullet wound a permanent reminder of the price of his redemption. The deed to the ranch lay on the table between him and Eliza. His eyes, for the first time in years, were clear. The terrible thirst had been burned out of him by pain and shame, and replaced by a quiet, fragile resolve. "I cannot stay here." "Ellie," he said, his voice low and steady. "This land holds too many of my mistakes. Every rock, every fence post, they all cry out with my failures." He looked at his hands. Once the strong hands of a rancher, now pale and trembling slightly. A man cannot heal in the place where he broke himself. "I need to go, find work, honest work. I need to earn my sobriety every day, far away from the temptation of forgetting." He pushed the deed across the table. "This is yours. It always should have been. You have the strength that I lost. You see the world with clear eyes. You will make it thrive." Eliza looked at her father, and for the first time, she saw not the weak man who had betrayed her, but a man trying, with all his might, to piece his shattered soul back together. The anger in her heart had cooled, leaving behind a deep, aching sadness. She knew he was right. His journey back to himself had to be walked alone. She nodded, her throat too tight for words, and pulled the document toward her. It was a final, painful but necessary cutting of the old ties. A few days later, in the thin, silver light of dawn, Eliza walked to the creek. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and creosote. She came to the spot where she had first seen him, the place where their two worlds had collided in a silent, watchful standoff. He was already there, as if he had known she would come. Kohana stood by the water's edge, watching the sky turn from gray to a soft, blushing pink. He turned as she approached, a quiet welcome in his eyes. For a long moment, they simply stood together, listening to the gentle murmur of the water. The only sound in the vast, sleeping landscape. The war was over. The lies were silenced. The shouting was done. All that was left was the quiet truth between them. "The peace is real this time," Eliza said softly. "Yes," Kohana replied. "An agreement on paper, but that is the easy part. Building a future is harder." He looked at her, his expression serious. "The world is changing. The railroad will bring more people, more anger, more greed. The fighting will come again, in a different form. Then we will have to be strong enough to meet it," she said. He took a step closer. The space between them, once charged with tension and suspicion, was now filled with a different kind of energy, something warm and alive. He reached out and gently took her hand. His touch was warm and firm, a silent anchor in the uncertain world. She did not pull away. She laced her fingers through his. He looked at the yucca bracelet still on her other wrist, its pale fibers now soft with wear. He touched it lightly with his free hand. "This was a promise of peace between our peoples," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I want to make a different kind of promise now, a promise between us." Eliza looked up into his dark, steady eyes. In them, she saw not a warrior or a chief, but a man who had seen her at her most vulnerable and had shown her respect, a man who had fought beside her, who had trusted her, a man she had come to trust with her life and with her heart. "So do I," she whispered. He raised their joined hands and gently touched her forehead with his own. It was a gesture of profound intimacy, a quiet pledge that needed no words. The world fell away, leaving only the two of them, the cool morning air, the sound of the life-giving water, and the silent, unspoken promise of a shared path. They stood like that for a long time, two people from different worlds, who had found in each other a common ground, a shared home for their hearts. After a while, a slow smile touched Eliza's lips, breaking the beautiful solemnity of the moment. She leaned back slightly, her eyes twinkling with a sudden, playful light. "If I am to be a queen in this new arrangement," she said, her voice laced with gentle humor, "I must insist on a special privilege. I demand the right to sleep in one morning a week." Kohana's serious expression melted away, replaced by a warm, genuine smile that transformed his entire face. He played along, his voice taking on a tone of mock gravity. "That is acceptable," he said. "But the first privilege of the queen is to command the chief to make the morning coffee." Their union was not a simple affair, for it was not just two people coming together, but two worlds. To honor both, they held two ceremonies, each a reflection of the culture it represented, each essential to the foundation of their new life. The first took place in the Chiricahua Rancheria as the sun began to set, painting the canyon walls in hues of orange and deep rose. The entire community gathered, forming a wide, silent circle. Eliza wore a simple doeskin dress, a gift from the women of the tribe, and Kohana wore the traditional buckskins of a leader. They did not stand before a preacher, but before the collected wisdom of the elders. An old woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, brought forward a single, heavy blanket woven with the symbols of their people, the hawk for clear sight, the horse for strength, and the zigzagging line of the lightning for power. She draped it over both their shoulders, a single covering that bound them together. They were then led to a small, ceremonial fire from which the fragrant smoke of burning sage and sweetgrass rose in a thin, gray column. As they passed through the smoke, an elder spoke in the low, musical tones of the Chiricahua language. Kohana translated softly for Eliza, his voice a quiet murmur against her ear. The smoke was for cleansing, to wash away the ghosts of the past, the anger and the misunderstanding, leaving only what was true and strong. They were not asked to promise eternal love or blind obedience. They were asked to pledge mutual respect, to promise to share the burdens of leadership, to listen with an open heart, and to defend the well-being of both their peoples as if they were one. It was a vow of partnership, a solemn oath of equality. The second ceremony was held 2 days later in the town's meeting hall, the same room where Avery Pike had been condemned. It was an affair of law and ink, designed to satisfy the world of deeds and property lines. The new circuit judge, a man who had been impressed by the quiet dignity of the water treaty signing, agreed to officiate and record the document. It was not a marriage license in the traditional sense, but a legally binding contract of co-ownership for the Hart Ranch and its associated water rights. It was Eliza's idea, a shrewd and practical move to ensure that no man could ever again question Kohana's right to be on that land, or try to use their union to claim it for himself. It silenced any future whispers of impropriety before they could even begin. Maria Ortega stood as their witness, her back straight and her eyes bright with pride. As Eliza and Kohana signed the document, their hands side by side, a man in the back of the room, a rancher who had been a vocal supporter of Pike, muttered just loud enough to be heard. "Still seems like he paid a handsome price for that land." Maria turned, her gaze sharp and unwavering, and her voice, though not loud, filled the silent hall. "The price he paid," she said, her words clear and deliberate for all to hear, "was for a shared future, not to buy anyone." The man flushed red and fell silent. The final, ugly echo of Pike's life finally and completely extinguished. 3 summers passed. The land, nurtured by the careful stewardship of 2 communities working together, began to heal. The grasslands around the creek grew thick and green. On the Hart Ranch, a small, thriving field of agave now grew, its spiky leaves a testament to the Apache knowledge of what the dry earth could provide. The herd of horses, a mix of ranch stock and hardy Apache ponies, grew strong and sleek, watering at the creek according to the patient, respected rhythm of the treaty. The town changed, too. Miles O'Rourke, his service in the Army completed, had been appointed the new United States Marshal for the district, but his greatest contribution was not in keeping the peace, which had become a surprisingly easy task, but in building the future. Twice a week, in the old schoolhouse, he held a class. Chiricahua children sat beside the children of ranchers and shopkeepers, all of them learning to read and write English from the same books, their laughter mixing in the dusty afternoon light. One evening, as Eliza sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the stars appear, Kohana brought her a letter. It had arrived with a supply wagon from the north. The handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. It was from Silas. He was working on a railroad crew in Colorado. He wrote, the work was hard, but his hands were steady. He had been sober for 2 years. He did not ask for forgiveness. He knew he had not yet earned it. He only wanted her to know that he was trying, every day, to be the man he should have been. Eliza folded the letter, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. It was not an ending, but it was a beginning. The story of what had happened in the saloon that day had become a local legend, a cautionary tale told to children about the poison of a hateful tongue and the courage it takes to speak the truth. Pike's vicious headline was remembered not as a slander against Eliza, but as the epitaph for his own greed. On a cool morning, with the dawn just a silver promise on the horizon, Eliza walked down to the creek. The air was still, and the world felt new and clean. A group of Apache children, who now played freely between the ranch and their camp, were already there, chasing each other along the water's edge. Seeing Eliza, they ran to her, their faces bright with affection. The youngest girl, with a shy smile, held up a small, delicate wreath she had woven from the long, pliant blades of river grass. With great solemnity, she reached up and placed it on Eliza's head. Eliza laughed, a warm, genuine sound that carried in the still air. She touched the simple, green crown. It was light and fragrant and more precious to her than any jewel. Kohana came to stand beside her, a gentle smile on his face as he watched the children run off. He turned to Eliza, his eyes taking in the absurdly beautiful sight of his wife, the rancher, the teacher, the peacemaker, wearing a crown of common grass. His smile widened, and he executed a slow, playful, and deeply respectful bow. "My queen," he said, his voice soft, for her ears only. She looked at him, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. The crown was not one of power or of wealth bestowed by a man. It was a crown of love and belonging, freely given by the community she had helped to build. The light of the rising sun caught the water of the creek, turning it to a ribbon of molten silver. She was home. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment below and let us know where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Remember to subscribe to our channel, Wild West Tales, like this video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.